Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, European allies, and intelligence analysts had anticipated, feared, and prepared for. A proposal that unfolded not over weeks of careful diplomacy, but in a matter of hours. That shocked European capitals. Hours that forced Zelensky's hand. Hours that revealed deep fault lines in the Western alliance that many had hoped would remain hidden. What President Trump did today crossed a line that America's closest allies had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, defiance, and unmistakable resolve. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the dangerous new phase this conflict has entered. Because what we witnessed today wasn't just a diplomatic disagreement. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of how this war should end. And caught in the middle of that collision is Ukraine, a nation that has spent 3 years fighting for its survival, and today made clear it will not accept terms dictated by anyone, not by Moscow and not by Washington. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic cables, just signals that the Trump administration was preparing something unprecedented. President Trump has been transactional, yes, but he has been predictable in his transactionalism. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a pattern, but what set off alarm bells in Kiev, Brussels, and London this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor diplomatic back channels know the indicators. The sudden increase in communication between Washington and Moscow, the unexplained delays in military aid shipments, the quiet recall of key diplomatic personnel for consultations, the sudden cancellation of scheduled calls between Zelensky and senior U.S. officials. All of that went quiet, and whenever the Trump administration goes quiet on Ukraine, it means something is about to get loud. European officials had been tracking these developments with growing concern. They knew that Trump had campaigned on ending the war quickly. They knew he had expressed admiration for Putin's strength. They knew he viewed the conflict through a purely transactional lens, measuring success not in terms of principles defended, but in deals closed. But what they didn't know, what no one outside Trump's inner circle knew, was just how far he was willing to go, until today. They found out, and what they learned has fundamentally altered the calculus of this war. Early this morning, State Department sources detected what they described as unusual diplomatic activity, including back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of channels that American presidents only use when they are signaling something very specific, a major policy shift, a willingness to negotiate, or an ultimatum. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the Trump administration was changing its posture toward Ukraine. And when an American president shifts posture on a major foreign policy issue without explanation, even by a small degree, the entire world pays attention. By mid-morning, the contours of Trump's proposal began to leak, and what emerged was stunning. According to sources speaking to multiple news outlets, President Trump proposed the following framework for ending the war. First, an immediate ceasefire along current lines of control, effectively freezing Russia's territorial gains. Second, a commitment from Ukraine to abandon its NATO membership aspirations for at least 20 years. Third, internationally supervised referendums in Russian-occupied territories. Fourth, a phased reduction of Western sanctions on Russia tied to compliance. And fifth, perhaps most controversially, a significant reduction in U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Regardless of whether Russia accepts the terms, this wasn't a negotiating position. This was a capitulation demand dressed up as diplomacy, and it came not from Moscow but from Washington. The response issued by Ukraine tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, statement after statement described Trump's proposal as unacceptable, a betrayal of shared values, and perhaps most importantly, a reward for Russian aggression that would destabilize global security for decades. But diplomatic language only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most forceful we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the proposal leaking, President Zelensky convened an emergency session of Ukraine's National Security Council, Within 4 hours, Ukraine's foreign ministry issued a formal rejection. Within 5 hours, Zelensky himself addressed Snorts the nation in a speech that left no room for ambiguity. These weren't the measured, careful statements we've come to expect from Ukrainian officials. These were declarations of principle statements that Ukraine only makes when it is preparing to stand alone, if necessary. And that willingness to stand alone, even against pressure from its most important ally, sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Tonight, Ukrainian officials confirmed that Zelensky's government has formally rejected every major element of Trump's proposal. On the territorial question, Ukraine's position remains unchanged. Not 1 inch of sovereign Ukrainian territory will be traded away. On NATO membership, Zelensky was blunt. Ukraine's security architecture is not a bargaining chip for anyone, not for Moscow and not for Washington. On the proposed referendums, Ukraine's foreign minister called them a recipe for permanent instability that would legitimize ethnic cleansing and forced deportation. And on the reduction of military aid, Ukrainian officials made clear that they would rather fight with less than surrender their future. Let me read you the key passage from Zelensky's statement tonight. We have not sacrificed so much, so many lives, so many cities, so many futures to accept terms dictated by those who have never felt a Russian bomb fall on their homes. Ukraine will decide Ukraine's future, not Moscow, not any other capital, Ukraine. That is not the language of a nation preparing to negotiate. That is the language of a nation preparing to endure. And it represents a fundamental break with the assumption held by many in Washington that Ukraine would ultimately accept whatever terms its patrons dictated. Today, Ukraine made clear that assumption was wrong. They didn't accept the territorial concessions. They didn't accept the NATO restrictions. They didn't accept the legitimization of Russian occupation. They rejected it all, and they did so knowing full well what it might cost them. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's latest demands, the heavy airstrikes we've seen over the past 72 hours, were designed to test the cohesion of Western support after Trump's election. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would pressure Kyiv to accept unfavorable terms. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't capitulate under the combined pressure of Russian bombs and American proposals. They issued a rejection that was so swift, so unambiguous that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Kyiv did. Senior European diplomats speaking with journalists under anonymity describe Putin's strategy as coercive diplomacy, a way to force Ukraine into accepting terms before the battlefield situation could shift. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to resist. The rejection was not only immediate, it was coordinated so precisely that European allies issued supporting statements within hours. That coordination matters because it shows that Ukraine is not isolated. It shows that Zelensky is not simply reacting. He is leading. He is shaping the diplomatic landscape even as his country absorbs devastating attacks. And that leadership in the face of pressure from both enemies and allies is what makes this moment so historically significant. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of both Russia's attacks and Ukraine's response. On the military front, Russian forces launched over 150 missiles and drones at Ukrainian infrastructure overnight. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted approximately 70% of incoming projectiles. At least 12 civilians were killed, including 3 children in Kharkiv. Critical energy infrastructure in 4 oblasts sustained significant damage. On the diplomatic front, France issued a statement supporting Ukraine's right to determine its own future. Germany called an emergency EU foreign ministers meeting for tomorrow. Poland announced it would increase bilateral military support regardless of U.S. policy. The United Kingdom reaffirmed its commitment to Ukrainian security way. This wasn't just Ukraine standing alone. This wasn't just a rejection of Trump's terms. This was a realignment. This was a signal that the European commitment to Ukraine may now operate on a separate track from American policy. And that separation is the one thing Putin has struggled to achieve since the war began. For every attempt he has made to divide the Western alliance, Ukraine and its European partners have countered with something that reinforced their unity. Today was no exception. Remember, Putin thought the West would lose interest after a few months. He thought Ukraine would collapse without American support. He thought Trump's return to power would hand him a victory he couldn't win on the battlefield. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is more defiant than ever. Europe is more unified than expected, and even within the United States, Trump's proposal is facing significant pushback from members of his own party. Senator Lindsey Graham, hardly a critic of the president, called the proposal deeply concerning. Former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said it would embolden aggressors worldwide. And a bipartisan group of senators released a statement tonight reaffirming congressional support for Ukraine regardless of executive branch policy. This is not the reaction Putin expected. This is not the isolation he hoped for. And this is certainly not the capitulation he demanded. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners in the Kremlin want a decisive military victory. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and access to frozen assets. Military commanders want more troops and resources. And ordinary Russians, increasingly feeling the economic strain, want the war to end one way or another. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing battlefield setbacks that have eroded his credibility. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The massive airstrikes we saw this week weren't signs of Russian confidence. They were signs of Russian desperation, an attempt to force a resolution before the ground shifts further. And Trump's proposal, whether intentionally or not, played directly into that strategy. It signaled to Putin that Washington might be willing to deliver what Russian missiles could not, Ukrainian capitulation. But today, Ukraine took that option off the table, and in doing so, they may have changed the trajectory of this war. The formal response from the State Department, now distributed to all U.S. embassies, was carefully worded but unmistakable. Officials acknowledged that the United States supports a negotiated end to the conflict, but they also stated that any resolution must be consistent with Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is diplomatic language, for we hear the criticism and we're trying to walk this back. You don't usually hear that kind of hedging from an administration that just made a major policy announcement unless something serious has gone wrong. And tonight, something serious has gone wrong for the White House. The proposal that was supposed to demonstrate American leadership has instead demonstrated American division. The offer that was supposed to pressure Ukraine has instead unified Ukraine's supporters. And the diplomatic initiative that was supposed to end the war has instead clarified just how far apart the parties remain. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a somber, determined speech tonight. He said, "We did not start this war, we did not invite this suffering, but we will decide how it ends." He said, "No nation, no matter how powerful, has the right to trade away the territory of another nation. That is not diplomacy. That is imperialism with better marketing." A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create permanent divisions in the Western alliance, calculating that a fractured coalition will eventually abandon Ukraine. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't equivocate. They didn't ask for more time. They didn't signal willingness to negotiate on Russia's terms. They rejected the proposal outright, and in doing so, they made clear that Russian strategy cannot count on Ukrainian exhaustion or Western betrayal. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can be pressured into accepting permanent losses. Ukraine wants to show that its sovereignty is not negotiable. European allies want to prevent the collapse of the security order they've built since World War D, and the United States, now divided between an administration seeking quick deals and a Congress committed to Ukrainian support, wants to prevent a catastrophic failure that would embolden adversaries worldwide. These objectives don't easily align, and how they're reconciled in the coming weeks will shape not just Ukraine's future, but the future of international order itself. Tonight, We've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements with heightened attention. They say Russian forces are repositioning in ways that suggest preparation for offensive operations. They say communication intercepts indicate Kremlin frustration with Ukraine's rejection. And they say Putin's decision to escalate airstrikes is likely part of a broader coercion strategy intended to break Ukrainian morale before diplomatic options close. But Ukraine is not breaking. In fact, Ukraine is consolidating. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and unequivocal, sent a message to Moscow that pressure tactics will not produce capitulation. And it sent a message to Washington that alliance does not mean subservience. European officials speaking tonight described Ukraine's stance as principled and necessary. That's diplomatic language for we agree with Kiev, even if we can't say it directly. And that quiet European alignment may prove more important than any single statement or proposal. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Trump hoped to achieve with this proposal. Was it a genuine attempt at peacemaking? Was it a pressure tactic designed to force Zelensky to the table? Was it a miscalculation that underestimated Ukrainian resolve? We don't yet know. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented the narrative from shifting toward inevitable compromise. It reinforced European commitment at a crucial moment. And it reminded the world that Ukraine is not a passive object of great power politics. It is an actor in its own right. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next several days. If Putin scales back attacks and returns to diplomacy, this moment will be remembered as a turning point toward negotiation. If he escalates further, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are not intimidated. They have shown they are ready to endure. And in this war, endurance has proven to be the most powerful weapon of all. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Russian state media, usually bombastic and confident, has been notably restrained in its coverage of today's events. The usual triumphalism is absent. The usual threats are muted, and when Moscow is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something that he should have learned long ago. Ukraine will not be bullied into submission. Pressure does not produce capitulation. It produces defiance. And nations fighting for their survival do not make decisions based on the convenience of others. This story is far from over. The coming days will bring new challenges, new pressures, new tests of will. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine remains unbowed. The Western alliance, though strained, has not broken. And the dream of a quick, easy resolution that sacrifices Ukrainian sovereignty remains exactly what it always was, a fantasy. This is a war that will be decided by endurance, by courage, and by the willingness to defend principles even when it is costly. And tonight, Ukraine showed the world that it possesses all three. We will be here watching every detail, analyzing every development as the next phase of this historic struggle unfolds.